So thank you very much for inviting me here. What I'm going to say is actually something coming from research that I did on my PhD, which was on museums and immaterial production. But I'm going to talk about this in order to meet the expectation of me to talk about museums in between Enlightenment project and commercialization. So this is not my actual current postdoc project, but it's work that came out of this PhD project. And I have to say that my knowledge here is completely coming from observations that I've made in institutions, in mainstream art museums. So I have and I feel a bit ashamed about that, I have very limited knowledge of these institutions from inside. But anyway, and the level on which I also have to make is, I have to admit that it makes me a bit nervous that Sonia started out talking about Paolo Verno, and she's a philosopher and expert in Verno, so please correct me when I'm making wrong interpretations, because my presentation is going to be also about Paolo Verno and his notion of virtuosity. And the level that I want to enter this problematic of a possible dilemma between museums working in between the forces of, on the one hand, an Enlightenment project that has to do with education and democratic participation and so on, and on the other hand, a stronger tendency to commercialization, or as we heard before, stronger pressure on museums to obtain external funding. I'm going to enter this dilemma at the level of economies of meaning. So I'm not going to address it as kind of a concrete level, but at the level of economies of meaning. So. And I think that this will address the problematic at a quite subtle level of the discussion. So during the past decade, art museums have accommodated new strategies of exhibiting, developing new formats and new types of complex events, if not project formats, that to a larger degree connect immediately to audiences and to society. Relevant and contemporary are two values that many museums aspire to embrace, and in this pursuit, however, one can observe how museums negotiate basic assumptions about visitors, about education, about participation and political issues. And this negotiation also takes place and can be observed at the level of curatorial procedures. So in the following, I will argue that there are two economies of meaning that structure this negotiation. And one of them is what I call the disciplinary economy, which is about basically about forming subjects. And the other one is a leisure economy, which is basically about immaterial consumption. So, talking about disciplinary economy, I refer also to Tony Bennett and others who have argued that the educational procedures of museums and the forming of modern subjects have been historically designed as powerful disciplinary mechanisms. So, as mechanisms that normalize through the logic of self-instruction, in other words, through structures of knowledge, of belief. So you can form a subject by bringing this subject into believing a specific order of the world, or social relations and so on. So in relation to art, this means that artwork have historically served the function of being a mirror of autonomous and free subjectivity. What characterizes these disciplinary procedures, also according to Bennett, is that they are authoritative and strategic. They embed specific naturalized assumptions of, firstly, who are the subjects of education, and secondly, what are the terms and purposes of educating subjects in the first place. And in Foucauldian terms, this amounts to what would be then called the governmentality principle of museums. On the other hand, we have a leisure economy which is increasing and have been increasing for a number of years. And this has to do with the fact that museums are affected in various degrees by new cultures of consumptions, which we could call a culture of advanced consumption that has endorsed values of participation, difference, critique into a lifestyle consumption. And this is also a form of consumption that addresses life-fulfilling higher needs. So this has to do with events that offer some kind of intensification of experience that unites affective, social, and discursive elements into one event. And the following examples I'll try to show how these two economies of meaning become coordinated through curatorial procedures in museums. My first example is a public event in MoMA, New York, and the second is a collaborative exhibition project called Who Knows Tomorrow in Berlin, and both took place in 2010, so they're not very recent, but still, yeah. So, in order to qualify what this procedure of coordination means, I will employ the concept of virtuous action from the Italian post-Marxist philosopher Paolo Virno. Virno defines virtuosity, and Sonia already provided a definition of virtuosity, so I can complement this as he talks about virtuosity as a mode of coordinating various heterogeneous and sometimes intrinsically irreconcilable elements into a seemingly consistent whole or unity. So in his Grammar of the Multitude, Virno has brought up this notion of virtuosity in relation to the subject of post-Fordist production. Post-Fordism denotes a state of society in which production have moved away from the industrialized Fordist notion of production as intimately connected to the manual production of commodities or material goods. Post-Fordist society is characterized by the displacement of production to the field of communication, to knowledge production and immaterial services. So, in order to understand Virno's notion of virtuosity, it's necessary also to understand the idea underneath this of production in an expanded field. Production, and this is the quote here, in the sense that Virno uses it, points to a production not of material goods, but of social relations, of imaginary relations, of the ethical dimension of life, actually. So he says not only, it means not only one particular economic configuration, but also a composite unity of forms of life, a social, anthropological, and ethical cluster. In order to explain further the implications of this mode of production, Virno argues that it is symptomatic of a contemporary conflation of formerly distinct areas of experience, and these are labor, action, and intellect. And this is actually something that he picks up from Hannah Arendt and her definition in The Human Condition of a tripartite division between two different areas. In post-Fordist society, Virno argues, labor takes on the characteristics of action, which is political, and intellect, which is equals the activity of thought, and it is incarnated in the figure of the knowledge worker who develops ideas, innovates production, who constantly finds new ways of enhancing production, of meeting the needs in consumers for life-fulfilling experiences. And I think that's why I included this picture of Steve Jobs, because he kind of incarnates this figure. Virtuosity in this scheme is the publico-political function which creatively structures knowledge into attractive economies of meaning. It is communicative and public, it presupposes an audience. Werner picks up this concept, which is traditionally connected to artistic or skilled performances. Traditionally it becomes applied in relation to musical concerts, but here it didn't. But what is special for the post-Fordist virtuosity is that its end project is the performance itself, so it completes itself by performing it. In this way, it refines and elaborates its means of communication to the outmost, thereby deeply convincing and affecting an audience. The relevance of Werner's concept of virtuosity in relation to contemporary society is that it addresses the seminal function of linguistic and communicative performances, and it points out how this type of production is symptomatic of how value becomes shaped today, as convincing orders of meaning, as effective and intelligible clusters. As the art institution has become part of the contemporary culture of knowledge and experience, the linguistic and communicative performances become increasingly important. They connect discourses to institutional structures, to common knowledges, to social experience and material objects, and connect all this into convincing structures of meaning. This scene in MoMA, which was placed, it's an installation put up during the summer 2010 in the Marin Atrium at the second floor, was part of the exhibition Contemporary Art from the Collection, curated by Kathy Holdreich and Christoph Siri. Whereas the main part of the exhibition took place in the adjoining third floor galleries, two artworks had been installed in the open atrium, together forming a spatial organization and setting up at the same time a frame for a public event. The atrium differs from the exhibition galleries in being a place of social ambience. Architecturally, it's organized as an open public space. One can overview the floor and the life that takes place inside. Yeah, you can see here it has this kind of, you can look down on the floor. The space thus has the potential of a stage or a public forum. In the space, a Fluxus work by the American artist Yoko Ono was installed, and as part of the display, a microphone had been placed in the center of the atrium. On the wall, one could read the following message, and it's up there. No, it's this one. Can you read it? In which the museum invited visitors to follow Ono's instruction and scream into the microphone. On the right-hand side, facing the gallery entrance, a large wall painting by Kara Walker had been placed. This assemblage constituted an interactive situation in which, following the information on the wall text, the issue of having a voice, of the violence of slavery, of the sexual abuse of women slaves, and of the deprivement of having one's own voice was brought up. At the same time, it, even though in an indirect way, addressed the issue of the museum as an agent of non-intervention, And this can also be seen in the wall instructions, where it says here, I pointed out here, it says, many Fluxus works breach the conventions of art institutions. Voice Piece for Soprano, which is the title of owner's work, is a venue for expression without interference from the museum. Added to this, the installation invited people to use the microphone and to improvise a performance in front of the rest of the audience. And I have some examples of this. Yeah. One. Okay, so what takes place here? If you look at it from your curatorial point of view, several elements becomes coordinated. So what I can see becomes coordinated is one, a task to present works from the permanent collection to the public. So that's one, and also there's a direct engagement with ethical and political issues that are relevant to contemporary society, which is obviously the issue of having a voice, of the right to speak or to express oneself in public. Then there's also an engagement with the issue of creating public platforms for democratic exchange. That anyone here, at least any of the accepted museum visitors, could use the mic. And there's an explicitly stated self-expression at stake here also, I would say, of the museum, so which is present in this peculiar statement that here, that it is a venue for expression without the interference from the museum. So apparently the museum does not intervene. It is a free space and it allows political, controversial topics to be opened up in a non-conformist attitude, and it also prioritizes artworks that have a radical message. In this way, the museum curator virtuously, I would argue, coordinates at least three things. So one, it coordinates between the imperative of education, this goal of museums of informing modern free subjects, and two, the free option of immaterial consumption. So here you choose an activity because it's both pleasurable and it offers an intensity that is potentially life-fulfilling in itself. And three, it also serves the purpose of self-reassurance. It says, I would argue, a self-reassurant act that serves also to brand the institution as liberal, as dealing adequately and with ethical responsibility with acutely pressing societal issues. However, some key questions or key assumptions do not become addressed in this event at all. So, for example, does this event, you could ask, lead to a situation of, does it really lead to a situation of non-intervention on the part of the museum? And does it really create free subjects? My point is that the self-asserting attitude of the institution here is posed as a claim rather than as a qualified effort. Again, the museum employs an authoritative discourse to make unexamined claims. I would call it an unexamined claim to say without intervention from the museum here, because fundamentally the museum does intervene by setting up the social and discursive premises from which the event unfolds. So this is a basic tenet of institutional critique, always to look at the politics of the museum look for the politics of the museum in the economic and social structures that conditions exhibitions of art. So what also seems an unresolved ambivalence here is the fact that MoMA is fundamentally a bourgeois middle-class institution, and visitors entering the museum here are basically the kinds of subjects who already possess the privilege of having a voice. So I think there's a lot of ambivalences around this installation. And the reception situation also of the open event becomes clearer when people do shout into the microphone. It becomes a kind of social play. The self-awareness of the participants are far from the existential primal utterances stated by Yoko Ono. Against the wind, against the wall, against the sky, which on the contrary sets up a solitary relationship with nature and the universe. But here it becomes a social game, one performed by a privileged part of the social community. So one could say that the free voice is given only after the museum has determined the context of speaking and screaming. This happens because the museum does not direct attention to the disciplinary structures of the situation. You are either here in this situation, you are either seen or being looked at. In Bennett's, to go back to Tony Bennett's exhibitionary complex, this division constitutes a basic feature of museum governmentality. So the museum is not addressing the conditions of acting and actual behavior in that space, for which the institution is responsible. Yeah, I'm finishing. Okay, I need to skip the last example then and go on to concluding remarks. So what I've tried to do here is to highlight that a coordination between a disciplinary economy and a leisure economy of meaning in contemporary curating of events, and thereby highlighting the political dimension of curatorial procedures. So when working virtuously in between knowledge production, it is really important to be aware of the political dimension of this curatorial planning, and it is also very important to examine assumptions. To, for example, ask how does this act lead to a possible interrogation of institutional structures? Is it embellishing these structures, or is it posing questions to it? And I think that what is really urgent to do is to also ask how can virtuous action, because virtuous action is not inherently either bad or good, but it depends on what kind of use it's put into. So how can virtuous action be put to uses in ways that challenge institutional assumptions and examine basic categories such as subjectivity, participation, community, and so on? Yeah.